So here at Abhayagiri on Saturday night, we're nearing the end of Vasa, the 3-month period where we have determined to more or less stay in one place as a community, practicing together, studying the monastic rules of training. Tomorrow will be the final day for that period. And all of us have had a chance to take 2 or 3 weeks of solitary retreat during this time, and I just finished mine about a week ago. So it's been a while since I've been asked to give a reflection. I feel a bit rusty here. The theme that came to mind was based on last weekend. Ajahn Karunadhammo did a day-long online retreat for Insight Santa Cruz here at the monastery with some people attending too, and the theme that he chose to spend the day with was compassion. And I wasn't present for that, I was still on retreat, but it just occurred to me that maybe to share a few words on that as well. Hopefully I won't repeat too much of what he said. But compassion, karuna, one of the 4 Brahma Viharas, divine abidings, expansive, subtle, sometimes subtle, expansive states of mind. As Ajahn Sumedho calls the Brahma Viharas, the 4 mature emotions, kind of the best that the human condition can come up with in terms of a reference point, an abiding place. Compassion being the second of the 4. Traditionally defined as the genuine wish for others to be free of suffering. When I think about it, and when I try and cultivate that mature emotion for myself, that way of abiding, responding to the conditions of the world, what occurs to me is that it's strongly based on a very deep understanding, deep penetration of the First Noble Truth, that we can't expect that wish, that very deep, mature wish to be free from suffering and for others to be free from suffering until we really understand the core experience, deeply penetrate it, and allow ourselves to open up to that First Noble Truth. Because most of our lives are spent dancing around our suffering, trying to find bandages to placate it or distractions to avoid having to look at it. So we develop lifetimes of habits to deflect the experience of suffering, the unpleasant aspects of being a human being. We so much don't want it that we'll pretty much do anything to have to avoid looking directly at it, whether it's in the realm of, sensuality, stuffing our physical senses and also our intellect with all sorts of distractions and pleasantries that we can bring up in the conditioned realm. So we don't have to kind of look at that deeper level of the difficulties of being a human being, the downside, the things that we don't want. So, I think all of us that are here in this room know that at some level or another, that we're here to kind of answer that question that's lurking in all of our minds, in the deepest part of our being of is there a better way? Is there a better way than following the path that I've been following in order to get some sense of well-being, some sense of contentment, some sense of happiness? Is there something that will work in the long run on a much deeper level? And it is that opening up to of course, the Four Noble Truths, but particularly that first noble truth of deep penetration. That's the duty of the first noble truth of there is suffering, the duty to deeply understand, to deeply penetrate that experience. And then, of course, to go further to explore the cause and the path leading to the cessation of this kind of dukkha. But that first step is one that we kind of often try and skip over, get to the third step, the realization of the end of suffering. Somehow we think if we can just plant our hearts and our minds in the third noble truth, then maybe we won't have to actually experience the first. So willingness to open up and to go there. One of the great supports that I've found and that I over time just more and more appreciate is the support for that exploration by living in community. I was talking with Lung Pa about this the other night after some talk. I can't remember exactly where it was, but it was after an evening talk of some sort, and just feeling this overwhelming gratitude for being in community and kind of feeling a bit, a sense of concern for sometimes people, monastics, go out on their own or practice as hermits and for most of their career, if not all of it. Some people either start out that way or train for a while in a monastery and then go out on their own, sometimes never to return to communal living. And that's suitable for some people in some ways. You can see it can be beneficial for having periods, and sometimes extended periods, of solitude to really settle in to some of the deeper contemplative practices. And then, of course, some people just aren't suited for community life, just can't do it for whatever internal reasons, and aren't good community members and supportive of the communal approach, and kind of have to be on their own. But I think one of Ajahn Chah's discoveries for himself was when he in his early days, of course he trained in as a novice and junior monk in monasteries, but fairly early on went out on his own and did a lot of solitary practice, wandering, and was able to experience some very strong fruits from that kind of practice. But he realized whenever, if I remember the stories correctly, that whenever he'd find himself back in community, a lot of the underlying defilements would just surface again, and that the trials and tribulations of being with other people and what it brought up hadn't really been addressed, and that some core obstructions were still there that could only be realized in that kind of bump and grind in the presence of other people. And so after some time, he gravitated back towards that communal style of practice, and that's how he developed Wat Pah Pong and then the branch monasteries that came from that as a very communal-oriented approach, because it's where you can really learn, where our habits are held deeply when you're living in close quarters, in close contact with people. There's going to be challenges to those defilements that are lurking underneath. So, we have our community here, of course, the monastic community, which I'm so grateful for. Other people live in a different kind of community, whether it's family, households, or with friends in groups. We all have our different forms of community, but to use that and not to run away from that and to let it do its work and be our reminder, and to be willing to look at what comes up and to look at it honestly. This is our opportunity. Some during this past retreat, and then actually I found myself in the past year or two finding refuge in kind of letting those old habits really, really surface. It's sort of like I can be sitting there sometimes, or have been the past couple of years, and quietly minding my own business, and something comes up that's based on some sort of underlying tendency or underlying defiled state of mind, greed, hatred, delusion of some sort, and something arises in the thought pattern, the thought train starts to go crazy, and then I catch it and say, okay, well, there's that habit again. It's coming up again. Why doesn't it go away? It just keeps on happening. I wish it weren't. The underlying feeling is, I wish I didn't have to experience this. And then my refrain in response to that has been, hold it, Karunadhammo. This is what you're here for. You're here to let these things come up and to experience them and to be willing to look at them. This is the time, this is the place, you've got the opportunity. They're there and they're not going away. So look at it and be with it and be grateful that you've got the time and the space to start to deeply understand this cause of suffering, or this first noble truth, that there is this suffering, to know it. And I don't think that would happen without the opportunities of living in a community like this. So, incredible gratitude for this opportunity. So this motivation to be free from suffering, I think that's what this compassion is all about. It is based on this deeper understanding. We don't have that motivation to do something about it unless we really learn to own up to it and experience it in an honest way. And then when we do that motivation, that compassionate motivation for ourselves and then extended to others, comes up to, let's do something. Let's take some action. That's compassion. I remember one of the early on experiences in my early years here, in that facing suffering based on community issues was coming up fairly regularly. There was a person here at the time who was struggling, like we all were, and there was this tendency on their part to get very frustrated with certain things, and sometimes that person and I would even have some disagreements about different aspects of what was going on in the community, and sometimes the interactions would get very frustrating, very difficult in going back and forth and trying to explain each other's viewpoint, and sometimes it would devolve into that other person saying things like, "You just don't understand. You just don't understand. I wish somebody could understand what I'm going through." Almost kind of like my problems are, and my issues and my suffering is unique, and that if only other people could understand, then it would somehow make that person feel better. And it would just go on, and I would start to feel guilty, sort of like, oh my, I don't understand. Why can't I understand? It's sort of like I felt the blame. I took on the blame of not being able to understand so that this other person would feel better. And for a long time it would just end there, and then it would things would settle down and pick up again in a few weeks or a few months. Something else would happen along the same lines, and back to, you just don't understand. And that guilt would arise again. And it wasn't until some time later that, thinking about this pattern that the two of us had going back and forth, and realizing that, yeah, it's true, actually, on some level, I don't understand, and I can't understand completely what that other person is going through, because I'm not in that other person's shoes. And at some level, their suffering is unique in some ways, in some patterns, but really, when it comes down to the core cause of dukkha, the core cause of suffering, all of our suffering is really the same. But we get lost in our own particular form of it. We each have our own flavor. It's like ice cream. Some people are eating vanilla ice cream. Some people have a favorite of strawberry ice cream or whatever. But it's all ice cream, really, when it comes right down to it. So it's like the dukkha is all dukkha. We have our different flavors, but if we're really honest with ourselves, we go deeper than our own unique patterns, and to some extent, it is impossible to completely live in someone else's shoes and to understand their experience. And I don't think people really have the right to expect that. I shouldn't have the right to expect that everybody understands exactly why I'm having difficulty, or why I'm having the suffering that I'm having in my own particular form. So that was a real realization, and in terms of, but it was the power of that, living in that community and having to, in this community, and having to just kind of confront that over and over again until I realized, okay, well, it's that over-personalization of our suffering that causes us to keep getting stuck in it and not allowing ourselves to move. It's that taking ownership of it and considering it to be my suffering, my unique suffering, and not allowing ourselves to see the universality of it. So that's where, in my mind, that's where wisdom is actually a inseparable part of the development of compassion. It's like the old description that Ajahn Chah would use of samatha and vipassana being two ends of the same stick. You pick up one and you pick up the other with it. Same analogy, I think, for wisdom and compassion. You can't really have, true compassion, the wish to end suffering, without the depth of wisdom to understand its core characteristics, its core cause, the personalization of it, and the universality of it. And you can't really develop that wisdom without the owning up to that First Noble Truth, the opening, the beginning of compassion, the realization, there is dukkha. This is part of human life. And that's where the motivation for developing that wisdom comes from. So they go together. They're not, you can't separate them to develop them fully, to develop them both fully. Kind of a real story that I remember from reading about, well before I was a monk, it really made an impression on me in a book. I think it was from a book rather than or a talk that Stephen Levine was telling about an experience. He used to work with, of course, with people who were dying, checking out the psychological, emotional, spiritual aspects of the death process on a very deep level, and teaching around that. And one of the stories that, this is all paraphrased, I probably got some of the details wrong, but of a woman who was suffering a very severe illness, in great physical and emotional pain, and really, really embedded in strong resistance, and just incredible anger to what it was that she was having to go through. So, you've got your physical pain and you've got your emotional pain, and then compounded with this incredible aversion, anger, resistance, railing against the unfairness of it all. And if I remember right, to the point where it was really causing people in her life to feel quite alienated, not wanting to be there to support her as much as they wanted to, but just feeling like, oh, this is very, very difficult to be with. That her, she finally came at some point when things were really stacking up, and she was in kind of a lot of very deep suffering. One particular time when it was reaching sort of a peak and crisis point, and I can't remember the exact circumstances that brought it on, but she started to surrender, and she had almost a vision, I think, of the fact that this great suffering that she was experiencing was not all her own. She had visions of the vast quantities, vast numbers of beings in the world, people in the world, who were experiencing the same kind of suffering that she was. It wasn't just her. There were countless other beings who had experienced and were experiencing this depth of discomfort, pain, suffering that she also was. And all of a sudden, a flood of images and beings who were exactly in the same position that she was started to come through her consciousness. And she just, apparently, from the story, if I remember, broke down, and just all the resistance, the anger, the hatred dissolved in that moment of understanding, deep understanding that she wasn't alone. This wasn't her personal ordeal, and she realized, rather than it being my suffering, that it was just the suffering, not just, but the suffering rather than my suffering. And that from that point on, from that deep insight that she had, the course of her illness was much, much more bearable. And she became a source of inspiration and light to all of the people around her, rather than a source of aversion. So, we need these kind of reminders along the way, and sometimes we have to kind of be brought to the brink before we'll start to surrender and realize that we don't have to take this on as a personal attack, a personal affront, this truth of suffering. it reminds me of also kind of an experience I had early on too. I've told this story before, so apologies if it's a repeated one for you. But before I was a monk, and it was one of my first retreats that I ever went to, as I was just getting into Buddhist practice, and it was with Ruth Dennison in Oregon at Brighton Bush, a 2-week retreat. And I had just been working as a hospice nurse for not too long, less than a year probably, and had my learning curve with that, and was had one very difficult patient. This was who was dying at home. He was a very young man, and it was very difficult dying process, and he was filled with rage, and just there was even one time when I was making a visit, and he was just so off the top with rage that he was throwing furniture around, and I had to duck. It was quite dramatic, but I basically felt quite helpless in trying to help, because it just didn't seem like anything I could do would make any difference. And kind of working with that, and kind of not dealing with it all that particularly well. I came onto this retreat, and as is usual on about day 3 or day 4 of these kinds of retreats, things start to finally really start to bubble up before they start to settle down again, and all this was just coming up, and I was feeling quite emotional, and went to an interview with Ruth, and kind of just started to break down, and all the emotion was coming out, and frustration, and sense of unworthiness, and not being able to help, and not being able to cope with this person's anger, and the tears were coming, and kind of she was very quiet and just listening and attentive, and I felt, okay, well, she's really understanding what I'm going through, and sympathetic, and kind of was emoting myself along the way, and then it came to a pause, and I looked at her, and she was kind of looking at me, and then kind of a look of concern, but then she said to me, she said, you're a real marginal case here now. And I kind of surprised at how she said that and what she said, and I wasn't quite sure what she was saying, and then she said, you probably really shouldn't be here at this retreat. You're really marginal right now. And she had this kind of look of kind concern on her face. And I don't know how she knew, she's a very deeply intuitive person, but somehow she tuned into my drama, and was gently, politely calling me on my drama of that, how I was emoting there. And it just kind of like was cold water on my face, splashed on my face, and it was like, immediately the thought came up to me was, I'm not a marginal case. How could she think I'm a marginal case? I'm healthy. I'm not psychologically imbalanced. And it was just kind of the wake up that I needed to realize that I was just kind of personalizing everything so much, taking on this sense of ownership of this other person's difficulties, and essentially, assigning myself too much self-importance as to the role that I could play in a situation like that. And it was a very useful wake-up call to realize how, whether it's our own suffering or someone else's suffering, or how we approach it is the most important thing, and realizing that their suffering, my suffering, my reaction, all of this is just the universal truth of dukkha, and that the key to the ending of it, whether it's someone else's or one's own, is that realization that it's not who I am, and it's not all about me. So, the danger, I think it becomes more clear, the danger of not realizing that is that we kind of move into what in some of the teachings, the later teachings and commentaries, call the near enemy of compassion. So that if we don't have the wisdom component with it, and that level of maturity to hold suffering clearly with wisdom, then we can move into kind of slightly distorted versions of compassion. So that if we're experiencing or witnessing some sort of major kind of dukkha in ourselves or others, and we move into sort of a slightly aversive state, or not clearly comprehending kind of a state of mind, we can respond with more of pity, not pity as in rapture, but pity as in feeling sorry for ourselves or feeling sorry for someone else is what we think is maybe a compassionate reaction, but it's more it's not a full it's not compassion with a full understanding. It's realizing there's some pain, but just kind of feeling when it's relation to somebody else, almost kind of feeling a little bit condescending of that poor pitiful creature kind of a thing, if we don't see it clearly. Or maybe more commonly, such as in the case that I had with that angry patient, that if we don't see it clearly ourselves and the other person and their personalization of it, we can move into overwhelm, which is one of the other ways of describing the near enemy of compassion. We think we think we're trying to help someone else or deal with our own pain, but without that wisdom component, without that seeing the impersonalization of it, the not self aspect of it, then we move into overwhelm rather than true compassion. True compassion would give us the motivation to be clear and to seek out a way of releasing the cause of it, abandoning the cause of the dukkha, but overwhelm just clouds the picture even more. So again, that particular way of viewing it gives a perspective on the importance of the wisdom component when we're examining, exploring suffering. So I guess really the basic overall thought that I have with all of this is just the importance of and the dual nature of how they're inseparable: wisdom, compassion, clear seeing, clear knowing, and opening up honestly to that First Noble Truth of suffering. And then looking deeply into the cause, the attachments, the clinging, the distorted ways that we have of viewing the world and what we can expect from it, and to really cultivate those those wisdom teachings, those explorations as to the reality of our life as a human being, and then allowing that compassionate motivation to realize the end of suffering, and the fact that we have to explore that in ourselves deeply, and then the natural response, once we've at least developed some penetration and understanding, the natural response is to want to be able to share that in whatever skillful ways we can with other people, because we realize it's all the same. It's not different. It's mine and yours become irrelevant. It's just the suffering and the wish to be free from it. So I think that's enough for now. Leave it there for this evening's reflection.